Judge Malcolm Reinhardt had seen countless young defendants pass through his courtroom, some arrogant, some terrified, most utterly unprepared. He had assumed Caleb Monroe would be no different, just another reckless teenager who thought he could talk his way out of serious charges. Then the boy started talking. The atmosphere inside the Fulton County courthouse felt heavier than usual, thick with hushed voices and expectant gazes. The gallery was packed, spectators shifting in their seats, murmuring as they watched the scene unfold. At the defense table, Caleb stood, his posture loose yet deliberate. He wasn't slouched in defeat, nor was he tense with fear. Hands in his pockets, chin lifted, just slightly a silent defiance. 19 years old, charged with grand theft, auto and resisting arrest. On paper, it was an open and shut case. But Judge Reinhardt wasn't just looking at a defendant. He was assessing something deeper. Fingers tapping idly on the polished wood of his bench, the judge peered over. Are his glasses, lips curving into something between amusement and condescension. You think you're some kind of legal expert? His voice held the dry, knowing tone of a man indulging a bad joke. This isn't some school debate, kid. Scattered chuckles rippled through. The bailiff smirked. The court stenographer barely glanced up. Even the prosecutor, Nathan Sterling, allowed himself a slight grin. Caleb, however, remained unmoved. He wasn't laughing. He had been preparing for this moment. For years, not this exact scenario, but for a courtroom, for a challenge. While his peers memorized sports stats, he memorized case law. While they lost themselves in video games, he played through trial strategies in his mind. His mother, Veronica Monroe, a paralegal with over 2 decades of experience, had unknowingly trained him. At the dinner table, she spoke of prosecutors who took shortcuts, judges who had favorites, defense attorneys who barely fought for their clients. Caleb had absorbed it all, dissecting her stories until he understood not just the law, but the way it was used. But none of that mattered to Judge Reinhardt. To him, Caleb was just another kid who thought he was smarter than the system. Let's make this quick, Reinhardt sighed, flipping open the case file with practiced disinterest. I've got a golf game at 2. Another round of soft laughter echoed through the room. But this time, something shifted. Caleb didn't laugh, but the corner of his mouth twitched, just slightly. Not enough to be noticeable to most, but enough to mark the moment. Everything started to change. The weight of the courtroom pressed down on Caleb as he adjusted his stance, keeping his hands tucked casually in his pockets. He let the silence stretch, not too long, just enough to make them uneasy, enough to make them wonder if he was stalling, if he was scared. Then finally he spoke. Your Honor, before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution. Across the room, Nathan Sterling raised an unimpressed eyebrow. He crossed his arms, the ghost of a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. Go ahead. Caleb took a slow, measured step forward. You said, officer? Daniel Ortega personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct? Sterling exhaled sharply, already looking bored. That's right, and that testimony is written in his report. Of course it is. Caleb nodded slightly, turning his attention to Judge Reinhardt. Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence. A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Judge Reinhardt frowned, adjusting his glasses. On what grounds? For the first time, Caleb pulled his hands from his pockets, gesturing casually toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ortega never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. Sterling's smirk twitched just slightly. What are you talking about? Caleb took another step forward, voice steady, deliberate. Your Honor, if the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ortega's GPS logs from that night. If his report states that he personally witnessed me in the vehicle, then his location data should confirm that he was present at the scene at that exact time. But he let the sentence dangle just long enough to let the uncertainty settle in. I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder. A few jurors shifted in their seats. Judge Reinhardt's frown deepened. He turned toward the prosecution. Counselor? Sterling's posture stiffened. He cleared his throat, reaching for his papers as if the right argument might be buried somewhere. That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Caleb offered a small, almost casual shrug. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. If he wasn't, he trailed off again, leaving the rest to implication. A beat of silence. Judge Reinhardt studied Caleb for a long moment, then turned back to Sterling. Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs? Sterling hesitated. It was barely a second, but it was enough. Enough for the jury to notice. Enough for the gallery to notice. Enough for the judge to notice. Caleb had been watching trials for years, studying prosecutors, analyzing their tactics, their tells. And there was one thing he knew for sure: if Sterling was truly confident in that report, he wouldn't be stalling. Reinhardt exhaled through his nose, rubbing his temple. "Counselor?" Sterling finally shook his head stiffly. "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. The laughter was gone. The courtroom wasn't amused anymore. It was listening. Sterling adjusted his stance, shuffling his papers with a little too much focus. "Your Honor, while we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." Caleb tilted his head, considering the tub. Then, after a brief pause, he gave a small nod. "That's true." He took another step forward. "But let's talk about that evidence for a second." Judge Reinhardt raised an eyebrow, but gestured for him to continue. Caleb turned slightly, addressing the jury now, scanning their faces, making sure to meet their eyes. He didn't rush. He let the moment breathe. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my fingerprints being on the steering wheel means I stole that car. That's the conclusion they're leading you to. But let's take a step back and think logically." He let the words settle, watching the way some jurors leaned slightly forward, unconsciously engaging. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back and leave. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that same jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? There it was, the shift, a subtle one. A few jurors exchanged quick glances. Someone in the gallery murmured. Caleb pressed forward. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven, hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it, didn't take car, didn't drive it, didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. Another beat of silence. Then, in a voice edged with something sharp, something surgical, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Sterling cleared his throat, flipping through his notes. He was searching now, digging for something, to regain his footing. Caleb wasn't finished. And while we're on the topic, he continued smoothly, "Let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted." He turned back to Judge Reinhardt. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" Reinhardt blinked. It wasn't an immediate reaction. It was a delayed one, the kind that came from realizing you'd overlooked something. He glanced toward Sterling. The prosecutor hesitated. His grip tightened slightly on his pen before he answered no. Caleb let the answer settle. Then he nodded, like he had expected it, like that was all he needed to hear. "So let me get this straight," he said, voice calm, controlled. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence. No chance for me to cross-examine them. No opportunity to ask about the chain of custody, the margin of error, the integrity of the analysis." Sterling's jaw tightened. Caleb just let out a quiet breath, the faintest hint of a smirk ghosting over his lips. "Interesting," Judge Reinhardt sighed, pressing his fingers to the bridge of his nose. It was the look of a man realizing with growing frustration that this case was not going to be the straightforward, easy win he had assumed it would be. But Caleb wasn't done, because the next thing he was about to say, that was going to change everything. Caleb took a slow step forward, his voice steady but deliberate. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Reinhardt frowned, tilting his head. "The owner?" Caleb gave a single nod. "Yes, Your Honor." Mr. Stephen Calloway, the registered owner of the stolen Lexus, gave a statement to the police the night of the alleged crime, a statement that for some reason never found its way into the prosecution's filings. He let his words sink in, then turned toward Sterling. Do you recall what Mr. Calloway told officers that night? The prosecutor's jaw tightened. He knew exactly where this was going. Caleb didn't wait for him to respond. Instead, he reached into his file, pulled out a printed transcript, and read it aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the diner. Some guy must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the person they arrested. I saw the guy and he had a beard. The courtroom reacted instantly. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Someone whispered something under their breath. A juror shifted in their seat, eyes widening. Caleb held up the transcript for the court to see. This statement is from the original police report, the same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. He turned to Judge Reinhardt, his tone sharp but controlled. The arresting officer omitted this from his testimony. The prosecution ignored it. And yet they want this jury to believe that someone who doesn't even match the description of the actual thief, was guilty, beyond a reasonable doubt. Silence, heavy, thick silence. Judge Reinhardt exhaled slowly, adjusting his glasses. His gaze flicked to Sterling. Does the prosecution have anything further? Sterling's face was flushed, his grip on his pen visibly tight. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, then shook his head stiffly. No, Your Honor. Judge Reinhardt looked at Caleb, not like a judge looking at a defendant, but like a man reassessing something he had misjudged from the start. Then finally he leaned forward, his voice carrying through the now breathless room. Case dismissed. For a moment, there was nothing, just stillness. Then, like a dam breaking, the courtroom erupted. Some gasped, some whispered in disbelief. The gallery stirred, reporters scrambling to scribble notes, spectators turning to each other in hushed tones. The bailiff glanced at the judge, half expecting him to slam the gavel again, but Reinhardt remained still. Caleb didn't move right away. He let the moment settle, let reality sink in. He had fought the system on its own turf, by its own rules, and won. Judge Reinhardt, still gripping his gavel, studied him for a long moment. There was something different in his expression now, recognition, maybe even regret. Caleb met his gaze but didn't say a word. Instead, he turned toward the exit. He was almost at the door when, Mr. Carter. Caleb stopped but didn't turn. Reinhardt hesitated. Then with a quiet sigh, he finally said, You should consider law school. Caleb smirked. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air buzzed with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward. Caleb, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? Caleb ignored them. This wasn't about headlines. It never was. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Angela, stood waiting. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. She didn't say anything right away, just studied him as if trying to see the little boy he used to be beneath, the young man who had just dismantled an entire case. Finally, she shook her head, exhaling a, Boy, you scared me half to death. Caleb chuckled, scratching the back of his head. Had to take a risk, Ma. She gave him a look, one he'd seen 1,000 times growing up, then pulled him into a tight hug. You always were the stubborn one. The cameras kept flashing, the reporters kept shouting, but none of that mattered anymore. Across the street by his car, Judge Reinhardt watched. His posture was different now, no longer rigid with authority, no longer tinged with arrogance. His gaze was steady, thoughtful, maybe even conflicted. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another conviction. But now he knew he'd remember this one, because Caleb Carter had done something most people never could. He had made the system look at itself, and for once, the system had blinked first. Here's the lesson we need to remember. How many other cases had played out just like this? How many people had been convicted, not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that prioritized convictions over the truth? Caleb had the knowledge to fight back. But what about those who didn't? This was never just about one case. It was about all of them. Caleb knew exactly what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stood in. But next time he wouldn't be the defendant. He would be the attorney, and he wouldn't walk this path alone. If this story made you think, even for a moment, share it. The justice system is built on laws, but it's run by people. And people can change, but only if we make them. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going. Because next time, it might not be Caleb. It might be someone you know,